Hi everybody, my name is Andrew Peroni, and today we're going to be talking about resilient landscapes and how to make your yard as resilient as possible. Today we're going to be talking about a couple different elements of a resilient landscape. First one is desert adapted plants. Then we're going to be talking a little bit about watering practices. We'll talk about maintenance practices as well, grading on your yard, and then we'll talk about sharing success. So let's go ahead and start with desert adapted plants. So what you're seeing on here is the landscape plants for the Arizona desert brochure. And you can find this as a hard copy either by requesting it from City of Peoria, SustainableU, or you can go to amwa.org/plants. So when you're looking to select plants for your yard, or if you're trying to figure out if you have a desert adapted plant already planted in your yard and you're not sure, this book is a really great reference for that. And it is going to be really helpful for picking out new plants, especially if you're looking to have a yard that has a lot of resiliency. The plants in here are going to give you the best opportunity for that. So I'm going to show a couple of pictures here of plants that are highly resilient in our area. These are just examples, but I want you to notice a couple of characteristics about these plants. So you'll notice on these, there's three pictures here. The one on the left is, of course, the Texas sage, the leucophyllum, and then the one on the top right is cascalote, and then an agave on the bottom. And now, so all of these plants have something in common. They all have leaves that are very resistant to water loss, which is critical in our area. You'll notice these on a lot of plants that grow well here, even if they're not necessarily native here. They'll have really small leaves. They'll have a little bit of a leathery texture or maybe even a rubbery texture. You might see some spines or spikiness on these plants. And that all of those things, and sometimes they'll even have more of a grayish tinge, all of those things help to reduce the amount of water loss that a plant is going through. So that really helps with building up the resiliency of your yard. If you're trying to find plants that are going to be really tough, then those are the types of characteristics, if you're wandering around a nursery or you're looking online, that are really important to look for. Let's talk a little bit about design and how this can impact the resiliency of your landscape. You can still have a really beautiful looking yard even if you have it low maintenance or really resistant to water loss. So these couple of pictures here, I want to call out a couple things. You can see that there's elements of various types of texture. You can see that there's different heights going on. The contrast of the shapes with the kind of the white walls and screens behind it or the concrete. Both of these landscapes in this picture are going to be very tough. They're going to be very resilient because you can see that most of the plants in there are very desert adapted. They're drought tolerant. So they don't need a lot of additional care. They also don't need a lot of additional maintenance, pruning. And so these landscapes in times of stress, in times of extreme weather, are going to be in pretty good shape. And so you can see that you can still have a very high interest yard, even in smaller spaces, by taking into consideration some of these design elements in addition to the plant selection. So you can also see that there's some hardscape use in there with some pots and different texture through the rock mulch as well. Now what we want to look at is what you can accomplish with color. So letting the plants bloom is really important for our desert adapted plants. We're going to talk a little bit more about maintenance later on, but you'll notice some of these plants might be familiar to you, but you may not always see them look like this, and that's just because they might get pruned a little bit too much. So one of the keys to a really resilient yard is allowing the plants to grow to its form, because that gives them the ability to be highly adapted to all the different changes that are happening out in the weather. And it's important from a design perspective because you can have, again, a yard that has a lot of interest. You can see the difference here in some of these color, along with texture, along with using heights and forms throughout your yard. And yet all of these pictures here, these plants are going to be very resistant, very resilient in times of either water stress or heat stress. I like to reference this as well. It's from the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension. And it's a guide to what time of year the plants are blooming. So if you want to have a yard from a design perspective that has a lot of interest year-round, and yet you still want it to be really tough and not a lot of maintenance, this is a really great guide because you can access all the different months of the year, and it tells you which plants are going to be blooming at those times of year. So you can have a yard that has something potentially blooming in it in almost every month of the year, and yet it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a yard that requires that much more maintenance or water. So a lot of important things to consider in order to help keep your yard looking really great, even though it has a lot of resiliency. One of the things you want to avoid, we'll talk a little bit about some of these things we don't want to do to have a really resilient yard. One of those would be marginal species. So the picture that you see here is of queen palms. You may or may not recognize them because these are dead, but this I just took last summer, this picture. As you may have noticed last summer, a lot of queen palms did not make it. And that's because we had more than 50 days over 110 degrees. So these plants, even though they do okay when we have more mild years, they aren't really our toughest plants, and they can't handle when the weather gets more extreme. So I saw some of them that even were sitting in water and they still died. So it wasn't even a water question at that point. So avoiding these types of marginal species, especially if you're selecting plants for the first time, other ones that could be on the edge that are very common here might be like a hibiscus plant or even a ficus tree. Even though they can be kind of tough, they're still considered a fairly marginal species for our area because of our weather and the water requirements. So if you're in a place where you're creating a new landscape or you're replacing plants, avoid some of these marginal species. Okay, what about lawns? Can you have a resilient landscape with a lawn? Well, let's talk about it. Maybe you inherited a lawn with your yard existing, or maybe you're considering that you maybe want to have a lawn, but you want to be smart about it. Okay, well, let's talk about that. Lawns can still be an element of a resilient landscape. Well, how can that be? One of the most important things you can do with a lawn is to water it properly. So watering deeply promotes deep roots. You might have seen this in a visual sense if you know of any flood irrigated properties, areas that use raw irrigation water to water. They typically only get a delivery of that water once every 2 weeks, even in the summer. And yet it's so green. How does that happen? Well, that's because the roots of that lawn are really deep. Sometimes they're upwards of 18 to 24 inches. Now, the lawn in your yard may not be able to have that deeper roots, but you can still promote really deep roots by watering properly. That's going to make your lawn really resilient in times of extreme weather. A second thing you could do with lawns is not to overseed with winter grass. So, and the reason why that's important for a resilient landscape, not just because of the saving of the water, which is pretty important, but every time we overseed with winter grass on top of your summer grass, it puts extra stress on that Bermuda grass. There's competition for nutrients, and it makes it tougher for that Bermuda grass to come back in spring. It's usually going to start coming back right about now. We're in late March, early April. It's going to start coming back full force. And yet, if there is a winter grass on top of it, it makes it a lot tougher. Now there's competition, and that causes stress later on in the summer. And then you end up having to water more and care for it more. It's a higher maintenance, less resilient landscape if there's overseed on top of it. So something to consider for a lawn and a resilient landscape. And then another key point is in times of water cutbacks, or if you really can't water for some reason, you're really trying to save water, and you have a Bermuda grass lawn, you could turn that water off for a while, and that grass can go drought dormant. So what that means is it's going to look like it's dead, but in reality, it's still alive. It's just waiting till it has some water to come back. And you will know this is true if you've ever tried to take out Bermuda grass and replace it with something else, like a xeriscape, without using any type of chemical. If you just said, I'll just turn it off for a while, and then that first summer rain that comes, all of a sudden that Bermuda grass is coming right back. So even though it can be a pain when you're trying to remove it, the fact of the matter is if you have it and you want it there, that's a really good thing because you can let it go under a lot of stress and you can almost bring it back even years later. So a couple key points I want to cover with lawn, just doing proper maintenance. So that could be dethatching and aeration, especially with your summer Bermuda grass. And that's essentially just to help allow the water to penetrate deeper into the soil. We'll talk about our soil type later on. But we want to do the best maintenance practices we can for our lawn because that enhances how well it's going to perform in our yard. And it's going to maximize the water that's actually getting to it. Okay, let's talk a little bit, kind of leading into watering practices. So the three elements that are really important for our discussion today are going to be controller programming, the actual in-ground hardware, that's your sprinkler and drip emitters, like what those actually are, and then addressing leaks promptly. That's going to be pretty critical for a really resilient type of yard. So why do we need to change the program? We're not going to go into a ton of depth today on specifics of watering. There's other resources out there which I'll reference, but we want to talk about it today because it is such an important part of a resilient landscape. So in short, we need to water because differently throughout the year because of seasons. The seasons change throughout the year, so we need to water differently throughout the year. So what we use to determine that is what you're seeing on the screen now is the landscape watering by the numbers brochure. So you can reference that on the link below, landscapewateringguide.com, or you can request a hard copy from City of Peoria. And this is a great reference that I'm going to be referencing. You'll see in the later slides, it'll have a page number. So if you have this as a hard copy, you can reference that page number, and that's the information that I'll be kind of going back to. So this one is showing how often to run. So we want to see that there is a really big difference throughout the year in our area between the summer and the winter. So what that means is we do need to change the program. We need to be cognizant of that and make sure we're making the right adjustments throughout the year, because that's going to maximize the effectiveness of our watering for our plants. Another really important piece that we need to understand about how we water here is the type of soil that we have. So most areas, in the valley or lowland areas are going to have the one on the right, which is the clay or clay loam soil. And what that means is the water, when it hits the ground, is going to go sideways first to kind of spread, and then it's going to go down deeper into the soil. So you may be in other areas, if you're up on a hill or in a rocky area, you may have soil that's a little bit more like one of the ones on the left. However, most areas are going to be more on the right. But it's important to know what you have. And there are resources to figure out what you might have because that's going to impact how often you water. So typically when we talk about clay loam soil or clay soil, that means we need to water really deeply. What does that mean, water really deeply? It typically means if you have sprinklers that are watering lawn, you're going to water for more minutes, a longer amount of time in minutes. And if you have drip, that typically means more hours, just pure minutes and hours are going to have a longer time total. You may need to break that up into smaller chunks so it doesn't make a mess or pond or run off, but the total effect should be a long amount of time that the water is being applied. So how deep do we need to water? This graphic here, which is also on page 4, is just kind of to give you an idea of the different types of plants and how deep you want to water. So if you are watering a shrub, you don't need to water it as deeply as if you're watering a tree. So if you think about your yard, you want to make sure your trees are getting the deepest watering, and then your shrubs are kind of that medium deep. And then if you have some newer plants, even if they are a tree or shrub, if they're really new, their roots are not going to be as deep. So maybe they need to be watered a little bit more frequently or less deep. So, and then this slide here is basically showing us an example of how often to water. So if we're talking about where we are right now in late March, we're in that spring season, you can see if you have desert adapted trees or shrubs, the recommendation is about once every 14 days or so. So that seems like a long time, right? Once every 2 weeks. But remember, if we're watering really deeply, it's going to take that long for the plants and the shrubs to use that water up. So we don't need to apply water again. Especially if we're trying to have a landscape that's highly resilient. We want to stretch that time out because that promotes deeper root growth on the plants. So a little bit more about how often we want to run. You'll see that this landscape watering guideline, sometimes you'll see this as a yellow card as well. It has all these numbers on it. But if we'll just hone in on one example here, the desert adapted shrubs, there's a range on here. So this one is showing, okay, in summertime, once every 7 to 21 days. So that's once every 1 to 3 weeks. And that's just because our summers can be variable in how the weather is. We may have a stretch where it's 110 degrees, but then we may have a stretch where it's just in the high 90s. So for the plants, you may need to make a decision about how often to water depending on how the weather is going. But the main idea is they don't need water every day. They don't need water 3 times a week. If we're watering deep enough, then we want to stretch that time out in between. Okay, let's talk a little bit about hardware. So to use the correct hardware basically just means take a look at what you have in the actual ground in your landscape. So this one, we're talking about drip emitters. You want it to be labeled in the gallons per hour. Typically the ones that work best for us are going to be pretty low output, and they're going to be labeled somewhere between a half a gallon an hour all the way up to 4, maybe 5 gallons an hour. And so when you think about it, that's a pretty slow drip, which is good. That's what we want for our soil type. If you are looking to purchase some drip emitters, you want to look for ones that are labeled pressure compensating. And that's important because if it's not pressure compensating, you might have some that look like the two pictures down below, which are more streams of water. If you have those, then I would say, though, I would recommend replacing them. They are not going to be the best option typically for our soil if you're watering plants in the ground. They work okay for pots and things like that, but not as good for plants in the ground because it's applying the water too quickly. That water's not going to get into the area where the roots are. It'll run off, or it'll force you to water a shorter amount of minutes, therefore not watering deeply. So if you have those kind that look like that, then I would recommend swapping those out. Another piece of hardware information that you want to consider are where your drip emitters are placed. So your drip emitters, you want them to be, as this picture shows, on the edge of the drip line of your tree. So if you're looking at the plants from above, that's what this is showing, then these are the areas that you want your drip emitters to be placed. And that's because those are where the roots that are really taking up the water are hanging out. So we want to apply the water there as much as possible anytime we do need to do supplemental water, because that's going to help maximize how much water the plant can take up. If you have a lot of drip emitters near the trunk of the plant, especially mature trees and shrubs, you definitely want to move those out because too much water applied there for too long causes rot, and that's when you have trees fall over or die. So for more information on specifics of watering, I'd recommend checking out the programming irrigation controllers. So if you're trying to figure out, okay, I maybe know a little bit more how to water, but how do I put that into the controller? Then go ahead and take a look at that video for more specifics. This picture is, I like to add it because it's just an example of what we see a lot of times all around, a downed tree. And it could be potentially due to too much shallow watering for too long. You can see that that tree almost had no root structure. So it's important that we do water deeply for this type of reason. So what if you have high water use plants already in your yard and you don't want to just rip them out? Maybe they're mature, maybe they're doing okay. Then I would say consider all these same factors. Look at the landscape watering guidelines on how often to run. So in this example, if we say, okay, we have a high water use hibiscus and we are in spring or fall, then the recommendation is to water once every 7 to 10 days. So it's about once a week or so. So we want to do the same thing. It's still a plant operating in the same function. We want to promote deeper root depth. So we want to water really deeply. The only difference is maybe we need to water it a little more frequently than we do our desert plants, but the idea is still the same, water really deeply. Okay, what if you have a landscape that you are trying to make more resilient, but it's been watered a lot in the past? Well, when you want to do what we can sometimes call tree and shrub training, if you will. And basically that just means start with the shorter frequency. Maybe you have to start with watering once every 4 or 5 days. And then after about 30 to 60, maybe 90 days, depending on the time of year, then go ahead and transition that to a longer frequency, maybe once every 7 to 10 days. And then wait a little bit longer, monitor your plants, and then go ahead and get out to the maximum frequency. If we're talking about desert plants in springtime, it'd be every 14 to 21 days. So you can eventually get there. You might just need to kind of train your plants, especially if they've been either sheared excessively, pruned excessively in the past, or watered heavily in the past. Those roots are not going to be able to handle a really long time in between watering at the beginning. Eventually, you can get them there. So if you want to have a yard that's for maximum resilience, where you say, okay, this is all great, but I really want to have as much hands-off as I can. I really just want to have a yard that more or less takes care of itself. Then there are some strategies that you can employ to help that along to get to that point. And one of the big things is after you have, if you're already buying tough plants, you have a good layout, they have room to grow, you don't have to do a lot of extra maintenance for them. But you still, when you first plant them, have to water them a little bit to get them established. But then you can have a plan to say, okay, after they're established, then I'm not actually going to even have supplemental irrigation on it. I'm not going to have an irrigation system attached to it. All I want to do is hand water it. If we get 30 or 60 days without a rainfall, then you might say, okay, I'm going to go out there and water it deeply with the hose, and then that's it. And then just let the plants do what they want to do. And then if you have plants that don't make it and they die, then you could say, well, I'm replacing it with a tougher plant. So then eventually you're just going to have the toughest plants that are going to do well for your yard. And your yard might be specific. What works really well for you might be different because of microclimates, things like that. And then, of course, we talked about this, the training. So training the plants you do have to promote tougher, for toughness, so having deeper roots in the long run. And you could still eventually maybe get to that point where you don't actually have to water them actively anymore unless we get a really long, prolonged dry spell. Okay, so let's talk now about a couple of maintenance practices that are key for resiliency. Pruning is the big one that you hear about. There's a lot of resources out there on pruning, but I have this on here, the Shear It and Clear It, presented by the Hack It and Pack It landscape company. Oftentimes you see things like this out there where plants are very heavily pruned into little boxes or to little circles, and you see those poor landscapers working so hard out there, and you know, it makes me sad a little bit because they don't really have to work that hard for these desert plants. The plants don't really want to be pruned like that. In our area here in the desert, our desert adapted plants, our toughest plants, really aren't made to be pruned like that into shapes. You know, other parts of the country and world, it's okay, but here they're not really made for that because they're already trying to handle a bunch of extremes. So if too much pruning happens, then you'll get these kind of results where you might see this hollowing out, you might see it get really spindly, it severely shortens the lifespan of the plant, and it increases their water need. So if this is a practice that's happening in your yard, I would recommend trying to wean off of that. And this picture too, if you're craving an order of cupcakes, don't call your landscaper. I would recommend looking to see as well if the time of year that this type of thing is happening. A lot of times you're missing out on blooms if there's too many severe cuts happening to plants. Now you might have a scenario like this where you say, oh, the plant was too large. I had to cut it. It was in the way of something. So, and that's fine. We'll talk about, you know, what you can do in those kind of cases. But really, you don't want to cut it so much where you basically just killed the plant. At that point, you might as well removed it, like in this picture here. You know, you could also might notice this in a lot of non-yard landscapes, you know, commercial landscapes. So I like to call this one the dancing twigs estates, where you can see there's just a couple of leaves left on this poor tree. You know, if there's pruning like this happening in your yard, it's not going to help with resiliency. That's basically just really shortening the life of that plant or that tree. So when do you want to prune if you're running into that situation? The main rule is either dead, dying, or diseased branches. Those are definitely ones you want to prune, you want to remove. If you have a situation where there's some frost damage, you want to wait until the end of frost before you trim that. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Selective pruning for form, basically, if you do need to take a plant's size down just a little bit, or you're trying to train it, then that's okay. You just don't want to remove so much of the plant, and you want to avoid removing the large branches. If you do, you just want to remove it down to another large branch. So there's a lot of resources on pruning. We won't go into it too deep today because it's its own class. But basically, for a yard that's really resilient, you don't want to generally have to prune very much. It's going to be very infrequent. And then, of course, the main thing with selection is picking the right plant in the right place. Basically, that means if you're at the nursery or looking online, look at the mature size of the plant's going to be. And then really take a hard look at the area of your yard that you're thinking of putting it, and make sure that that plant is going to fit. And remember as well, the roots. So if you're planting and you have neighbors around and you have a plant that's going to get really big, and you say, well, I don't care if it gets big above because it's going to be shading our area, but you want to make sure you're not getting into a situation where roots are going into too many different places that you don't want them to, because the roots are going to be at least as big, if not larger, than the canopy of the plant. This picture here is of a lantana that had frost damage. And if freeze damaged growth, if you have the situation, is going to provide a layer of protection on that plant if there's another frost event that happens. So if you see it, don't cut it off right away because it's actually protecting the plant. Some of those stems are often alive and you're just seeing the leaves have died. So that stem could actually produce some new leaves later on and may actually regrow some. Okay, we're going to talk briefly about grading practices. So grading, not like when you're in school and you were looking for a letter grade, but basically talking about grading as in how your yard is shaped. So we want to think about how your yard captures rainfall. And we call this passive rainwater harvesting. Sometimes you hear the term rainwater harvesting, you think of the big cisterns and tanks. For passive rainwater harvesting, you're basically just trying to grade your yard so that when the rain falls on there, a lot of it's just kind of staying in areas of your yard, especially in areas of your yard where you have planting. So this picture is a good example of that. It's going to capture a good amount of water that falls there. And remembering that those plant roots are kind of be spread throughout. So even though it doesn't look like that water is right next to the plant, it's still good to capture it, because the second thing, remember our soil, the water is going to move laterally. So those roots and that water eventually are going to interact the more water you can keep in your yard. This is another good example of that. And even if you have some higher mounds, there's a little bit more sparse planting, but remember, those plant roots are going to be able to access the water still, even if you say, well, the plant's up here and the water's down in the basin. Don't worry, that's a natural thing. The plants are going to be having their root system pretty far out there. So just keeping that water in your yard is going to ultimately not only give you some free water, essentially, but it's going to reduce the amount of times you need to add supplemental water to your yard, because rainfall is typically going to be a little bit more effective for your plants, just because of the way it falls and lands over the entire soil of your yard, rather than irrigation. We're kind of trying to figure out as best we can where those roots are. And the last piece of a resilient landscape is sharing success. So what do we mean by sharing success? Basically, we want to talk about the things that have worked well for us in our yard. And it's going to be different for everybody's yard and neighborhood. And so it's especially important to share it with people just in your own community, because your community is probably going to share similar characteristics in terms of your soil type, in terms of your microclimates, exposure, things like that, where people will have success with certain types of plants and strategies. Why is this so important for resiliency in landscape? Well, this graph here, when I say we rise and fall together, this is a graph it's a little bit old now, but it's showing the water level in Lake Mead. And the main idea here is that we all share the same water sources throughout the Southwest. And so if we are all working to make our yards more resilient, then we can reduce the amount of supplemental water that we have to apply in order to keep our plants alive. And that's going to actually help us all together in the long run. So it's important that we share this information with each other. So this picture of a yard here is one that has a lot of resiliency. Just a quick example of that. You can see this yard has a lot of really tough plants, needs probably almost hardly any maintenance, maybe once or twice a year some trimming, and maybe no supplemental water at all. So if you have a yard that you're trying to get to that point, or you have a blank slate and you're trying to get there, then look for some examples out there of some yards that have really water efficient planting, plants that don't have maybe a lot of excessive growth from a lot of times that happens from extra water. So some ways that you can share success: talk with your neighbors, like we talked about, especially within your community. If you do use social media, then that's a great way as well, because you can put pictures of things that have worked, the plants that have worked for you, and share that out with your network. And then another way, if you want to get really involved and you really love plants, is you can become a master gardener through the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension. And those folks are great, and they are kind of our resident plant experts as well, to help answer specific questions about plants. And so if you're really interested in that, then that's also a great opportunity to grow your own knowledge, and then to have a lot of opportunities to share that knowledge out with others. And that is what I have today for Resilient Landscapes. Thank you very much for joining us.